The morning of that Wednesday felt like any other I had kept for 30 years. I woke at 5:30, the kitchen window paling with October light, the smell of coffee steady and familiar. My Bible, its corners softened from countless prayers, lay open on the table. I ran my thumb over the little cross pressed into the leather, my small pocket Bible, the thing I carried even when I only went 2 blocks to a neighbor's house. The pages smelled faintly of ink and time. I prayed, then dressed in the navy cardigan I've worn to every service, the tiny gold cross pin catching the light as I fastened it. I didn't expect trouble. I had suggested a change 3 months before. A practical request about accessibility ramps and a broader plan for the seniors on our list. I remember the meeting room's fluorescent hum, Pastor Richard's cologne like citrus and cedar, the way he smiled and said, "We need to reach young families." His voice was polite, precise. He touched my arm as I left and said quietly, "Maybe it's time for new leadership." The words hovered over me like dust motes. At church that night, the sanctuary smelled of old wood and hymnals. The hum of the air conditioner threaded through the opening songs. I sat in the front row as I always do, the hymnal familiar under my palm, the texture of the worn paper smooth against my fingertips. Nancy squeezed my hand. Walter nudged his wife, eyes steady on me, and for a moment the church felt like home. Then Richard adjusted the microphone. The sound of his breath met mine across the aisle. He said, "Before the scripture, I have an announcement." He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. Our dear sister Abigail Lewis has decided to retire from visitation ministry. His smile spread like paint drying over a canvas I thought I knew. I felt the hymn book go white in my grip, my knuckles whitening until the paper ghosted black across my fingers. The air in that sanctuary seemed suddenly colder. My heart hammered so loud I could hear it in my ears, like someone walking heavy in the room. I had not decided to retire. The word resignation tasted wrong in my mouth, foreign and brittle. Around me, coughs and the scrape of chairs became a tide. I could see Melissa seated a few rows back, iPad on her lap, expression composed as though rehearsed. When Richard named her as the new leader, the applause rose and filled the rafters. The sound felt distant, as if coming from another room. Nancy's hand was small and suddenly weighty in mine. Walter's jaw was tight. After the service, members drifted forward. A few came with cautious smiles asking, "Did you know?" Others offered quick, awkward hugs. The younger faces darted their eyes away. The hymn book, stained with the sweat of my palms, left a dark smudge across my fingers. I could feel each witness to the announcement like a small stone in my chest. Then Deacon Thompson appeared. His posture soldier straight, the old veteran stance I'd always respected. He said low, "No one told the council." His voice had the rasp of someone trying not to break. He stood beside me, and for a moment the room shrank to just us. The deacon, Nancy, Walter, and me. I inhaled, tasting coffee and old prayer cards in the air. And I knew I could not let that moment lie. I walked down the aisle, each step a soft thud on the wooden floor. The light from the stained glass threw colored bands across the pews. As I reached the front, Pastor Richard was talking with new members, his laugh precise. He looked up when I stepped close. "Pastor," I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. The microphone had been tucked away. "We need to speak about this." I set my Bible on the edge of the table, the spine catching the light. The little cross pin pressed into my heart. He suggested his office. I shook my head. "No," I said. I took my phone from my bag and let it vibrate once, twice, the small buzz of familiar, domestic sound that somehow anchored me. "I recorded our last conversation," I told him. "You threatened to reevaluate my role if I spoke up about the funds. You never said I resigned." His face paled. The room hummed quietly. Someone closing a door, the distant rattle of a bulletin. I felt my breath fog in the cool air. Then I produced the emails I'd gathered, folded and stamped with years of names, Families who had quietly faded away because they felt unseen. The papers smelled of printer ink in folded corners. Diagonal eyes gathered like anchors. "Abigail," he began, but the word landed soft and uncertain. He was used to shaping a room with words. That evening his words faltered. I remember the way my hands trembled as I held the evidence, how the gold cross on my cardigan caught the church light. I remember the texture of the hymn book pressing into my palm like a promise. I felt the old fear of being dismissed, and beneath it something steadier. A sense of calling that wasn't negotiable. Months later, I would sit on my porch watching the sun roll down the sky. Phone buzzing with Nancy's reminder about our house group. That night in the sanctuary was a hinge. The door he closed so publicly pushed us to gather elsewhere. Living rooms lit by lamps, not spotlights. We began to share meals and scripture, the sound of plates and low laughter replacing applause. The pocket Bible stayed where it always had. A small weight in my bag, its pages soft with use. But that night, walking out of the church with Walter and Nancy at my side, I felt the weight of many things. The chill of betrayal, the warmth of loyal hands, the rough grain of the wooden pews beneath my feet. I tasted the future like rain on parched soil, and I knew I would not leave quietly. The morning of that Wednesday felt like any other I had kept for 30 years. I woke at 5:30, the October light paling the kitchen window, the smell of coffee steady and familiar. My Bible, its corners softened by countless prayers, lay open on the table. I ran my thumb over the little cross pressed into the leather of my pocket Bible. The pages smelled faintly of ink and time. My loves, thank you from the bottom of my heart for spending these few quiet minutes with me. This channel is still finding its feet, and every new subscriber is a breath of life as we reach for our first 1,000. If this story moves you, please click subscribe. And write below which city you're watching from. It helps us feel closer. The morning I woke that week, everything smelled like routine. Coffee on the counter, a little too strong. The October light pushing in through the blinds and painting the linoleum in soft bars. My pocket Bible lay open where I'd left it the night before, pages thumbed to a psalm I've loved since nursing school. At 67, my days settle into patterns that feel like prayers. Prayer first, then breakfast, then the list of visits scribbled on the inside of an old envelope. My hands know the rhythm. Pour, fold, button the navy cardigan, clip the tiny gold cross to the lapel where it will catch the light when I stand. I had been a nurse for 40 years. I learned to read a room by temperature and breath, by the way someone wrapped their blanket tighter or cleared their throat 3 times before speaking. That is the same way I read my church. The Redemption Sanctuary has always smelled like hymnals and wood polish, like lemon oil on the pews and the faint sweetness of the choir's perfume. The bell at the steeple rings like a clock I was born with, 3 chimes for the hour, then an answering whisper as if the town itself is remembering who we are. The week before the announcement, small things shifted. At the welcome table there was a crisp, glossy rendering of a new building propped beside the guest book, a clean, square structure with lots of glass. Someone had set down brochures about expanded services and community engagement next to the coffee urn. The sanctuary curtain behind the pulpit, which had been the familiar deep burgundy for as long as I could recall, had been replaced with a lighter, modern teal that pulled the eye forward. They had placed a new LED candle on the altar, bright and efficient. Not the tremulous wax candle I used to light when I prayed for someone's healing. These were small gestures, but to me they read like language. On Tuesday afternoon I made my rounds. Mrs. Alvarez's apartment smelled like Vicks and cabbage soup. I straightened the throw pillow on her sofa and sang a hymn under my breath because she always hummed along. Mr. Carter took my hand and commented on how my nails had been greasier with all the gardening. I left with the tin of ginger snaps Nancy had baked that morning, and with the dusk pooling in my rearview mirror like ink. That evening I met with Pastor Richard in the church office. The fluorescent hum in that room always made me feel the walls were a little too near. He wore his usual, a well-cut jacket, the faint citrus of his cologne. A confident, on Wednesday morning I did the things I have done for years. I smoothed my skirt. I put my hymn book in the seat beside me because I always liked the weight of it under my palm. I noticed as I walked into the sanctuary, an empty pew 2 rows behind mine. An old man's place where he had sat for 30 years. It was empty now, the hymn book still tucked under the seat, as if someone had left mid-verse. I felt the emptiness like a chill. People said hello in the soft way our church does. Not loud, never rushed. Nancy squeezed my hand and Walter tipped his head, a little apologetic. There were new faces, yes, and a scattering of younger families toward the back where the light from the teal curtain pooled like a promise. Melissa sat a few rows back, iPad balanced on her lap. Her shoes were modern, her posture precise. I remember watching the way she glanced at Richard with something close to expectation. There was a flyer taped to the foyer door advertising Vision Night, and the rendering of that shiny new building. Someone had even placed a small model of the proposed foyer on the piano, smooth wood, sharp angles. It looked like a future without the rough edges we had learned to love. I prayed that morning for wisdom, not for vindication. I tied my cardigan a little tighter because the church draft is always cooler in October. I touched the gold of my little cross and thought of all the hands I had held in homes and hospitals, of names I still say by heart. My ministry is not something a man in a suit can sign away. But I also felt, in that tucked place beneath my ribs, the fatigue that comes with age, the ache that follows grief. I left the sanctuary that day with the sense of being both anchored and untethered. The building plans, the teal curtain, the empty pew, they were symbols I was starting to piece together. Not yet a picture but a pattern. I could sense a change in the air, a rearrangement of the furniture of our church life. And in the quiet of my car, with the engine ticking and the October sun warm on my hands, I resolved not to be pushed into silence. If my name was going to be taken from the bulletin, it would not be without my voice. The moment he spoke, the room shifted like a breath held too long. Pastor Richard smiled into the microphone, that practiced, easy smile that told everyone this was the right direction. I felt the hymn book under my hand go suddenly heavy, as if someone had set a weight on it. The sentence landed before he even looked my way. Our dear sister Abigail Lewis has decided to retire from visitation ministry. My knees wanted to fold. For a heartbeat I thought perhaps I'd misheard. Some echo in the rafters. Then the words repeated, crisp, the congregation folding them into applause. The sound was distant like a radio turned down too low. My fingers closed so hard around the hymnal that the edges cut into my palm. The paper smelled like prayer and dust, and at that instant, I could only smell ink and the bitter copper tang of my own fear. My chest tightened. There was a metallic taste in my mouth. I tried to breathe slowly, counting the seconds, because that's what you do after so many years of night shifts and tense moments. You slow the breath, you find your hands. But the breath didn't cooperate. It came short-clipped. My heart hammered against my ribs as if trying to escape. Nancy's hand squeezed mine. Her touch was small, warm, urgent. Walter's jaw worked. I could feel his stare on the back of my neck, solid and steady. Behind them, Melissa sat upright, iPad balanced on her knees, the picture on her face practiced into composure. She began to stand as they announced her name. The applause rolled over the aisle like a wave. I tasted the ink on the edge of the book where my fingers had left a dark smear. My thumb went unconsciously to the little gold cross pinned at my chest. It felt like an accusation and a comfort all at once. I had not resigned. The word fit in my mouth like a foreign thing. Resignation is a tidy, intentional act. Retirement is a planned closing, a letter written and signed. I did not know what to do with something that had been handed to me by someone else's mouth. Two things happened at once. Heat rose to my face and a small old alarm bell started ringing in me. The same bell that had woken me in hospital corridors for decades when a monitor drifted. In that ring was a line of other little alarms. Pastor Richard's, maybe it's time for new leadership in his office. The glossy building renderings, the teal curtain, the empty pew 2 rows back. Nothing was coincidence anymore. The announcement wasn't an accident. It had been prepared. My hands were cold, slick at the seams. I felt dizzy, as if the sanctuary had tilted. Light from the stained glass pooled against the hymnbooks and splashed colored bands across the carpet. People leaned forward, smiling. I felt exposed like a specimen under a glass dome. For a very small private moment it would have been easier to fold. To lower my eyes. To accept the kindness phrase dismissal and go home. Tuck the hymnal into a drawer. Pretend the ache wasn't there. My bones knew the comfort of retreat. 70 years of living teaches you how to bend. But there was another sound in my chest, quieter, steadier. A memory of grips and pulses and mouths thanking me at bedside. The names written in my little pocket Bible. The faces of people who had saved me from pride. Mrs. Alvarez humming softly when I held her hand. Mr. Carter's short laugh when his chest finally eased. Those voices threaded through me and made a decision feel less like defiance and more like fidelity. I felt the old call again. Not a title, but a tug on the inside of me that wouldn't be soothed by decor changes or slick speeches. The question folded into one simple thing. Will I let a man in a suit erase an entire ministry with a polished sentence? Or will I stand and answer? My throat tightened. The room blurred at the edges. Deacon Thompson's hand found the back of my chair. He leaned in and said nothing, which, coming from him, felt like the clearest statement. The look he gave was the look of a man who'd been in foxholes and committees, and had learned the exact measure of injustice. I stood up. Each motion was deliberate. No dramatic flourishes, no raised voice yet. Just a woman taking the steps she had learned in decades of walking into hospital rooms. Purposeful, steady, necessary. I walked down the aisle. The wood under my shoes sounded loud to me. The light cut across my cardigan, and the tiny cross caught it, catching at my chest like an anchor. When I reached the front, Pastor Richard had the practiced laugh that fits a comfortable man in a comfortable narrative. He looked up. "Pastor," I said. My voice surprised me with how clear it was. "We need to talk about this." He offered a courteous nod, the kind that says, "Later," as if conversation were something you schedule. I let the small phone in my bag buzz once, twice, and then put it on the table and opened it. I didn't need to say those next words the way I had practiced them. The air seemed to hold them for me. "I recorded our last conversation," I told him. "You said you'd reevaluate my role. You didn't say I resigned." My hands weren't steady, but my words were. I could see the color drain from his face in that moment, just a shade but enough. The congregation went quiet the way a field goes quiet before a storm. People leaned in without speaking. I reached into my bag again and slid out a small stack of printouts, the emails from families who had left, notes from widows who no longer felt seen. They smelled faintly of printer ink and the envelopes they'd come in. Deacon Thompson moved closer. Nancy and Walter stood at my sides. I did not shout. I did not beg. I simply stated what was true. I held the paper and the record like evidence, but also like proof of a life faithfully lived. When I finished, there was a pause that felt like a hinge turning. "What you have done here," Deacon Thompson said, his voice low and steady, "happened without the council's knowledge. That piece, publicness met with the quiet power of witnesses, was my turning point. In that suspended moment, with the hymn book in my hand and the gold cross at my heart, I chose not to leave quietly. I chose instead to make them hear the truth. The decision unfolded not from anger, but from the simple, stubborn devotion to the people I visit. When I stood at his table, the sanctuary felt too small for what I was about to do. People leaned in like they were listening to a whisper. The stained glass light made bright slashes across the carpet. My hands shook, not from fear as much as from the years of waking to sickness and setting bones of panic back in line. I reached into my bag and let the phone buzz once. Then I set it on the lectern and tapped play. "You'll be reevaluated," His voice said from the recording, cool, precise. I handed the stack of printouts to him. The paper smelled faintly of printer ink in living rooms. Emails from families who'd left, notes from widows who felt invisible, letters folded and kept for years. Nancy's hand hovered at my elbow, fingers curled like a prayer. Walter's jaw worked. His palms were the color of old wood. Richard tried to speak. He opened his mouth with one of those smooth sentences he'd used to shape opinion, but his voice was thin. This was an administrative decision for the future. He spread his hands, the way men do when they want to make space between themselves and consequence. Future for whom? Someone whispered. The whisper threaded down the rows. A woman I'd visited, Janice, who used to sit at the Wednesday Bible study, wiped her eyes. Her hands trembled around the corner of her purse. She had been one of the names in those emails. They stopped bringing the hymn books in large print, she said, surprise breaking into anger. Melissa rose. Up close, her smile was careful and bright like a headline. We're trying to expand outreach, she said. Her words were neat, stapled. We want to build a center that serves everyone. We're not marginalizing anyone. She paused. Her thumb absently played with the little silver cross at her throat, an unconscious gesture that read like apology more than conviction. You could see the room measuring her. The younger faces in the back pointed toward the rendering of the new building in the foyer with an eager, hungry look. The older ones, those whose names were stitched into my little Bible, sat straighter but quieter. Subtext hung between us. Modernization versus memory, growth versus care. Later, in the small council room with its humming fluorescent light, Deacon Thompson set the printouts on the table like heavy stones. For elder members gathered close, Nancy and Walter among them. The air smelled of coffee and lemon oil from the pew cleaner, and the hush of protocol made everything seem more consequential. He announced my resignation without my signature, without even a courtesy call, I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. Words felt like tools and I used only those I needed. He bypassed the council, the deacon said. That's procedure. That's trust. This wasn't a misstep. It was a maneuver. Richard tried deflection, talked about vision, future demographics, and the room narrowed around his buzzwords. Melissa sat quietly to his side, fingers tucked under her chin, eyes flicking like a bird between sympathy and ambition. Occasionally she would say, "We can adapt programs," as if editing a spreadsheet. Between the phrases, the real conversation happened in small gestures. Nancy's hand found mine under the table and held on, warm and unyielding. Walter cleared his throat and tapped his long fingers against the tabletop like someone keeping time with truth. Deacon Thompson's face hardened. The lines around his eyes deepened with a history of seeing institutions bending under single wills. People began to tell their stories in fragments. An elderly man who hadn't been invited to the new choir because his voice was old-fashioned. A family who stopped attending after their mother's mobility made the fellowship hall inaccessible. A woman who felt unseen when visitors stopped coming by. Each anecdote landed like a photograph. A face, a smell, a porch light left unlit. I kept thinking about Mrs. Alvarez and the way she hummed when I straightened her pillow. I thought of Mr. Carter's cough and how he clenched my fingers when the oxygen made his chest tight. These weren't abstracts. They were a life's worth of small loyalties. That is what the new lobby renderings could not show. The more the council heard, the more the lines between administrative decision and erasure became clear. There were moments when Richard's rhetoric faltered, when he tried to make stats sound like compassion, and they landed as indifferent. Melissa sometimes looked away, and when she did, I saw a flicker of something like doubt. Maybe she had not meant harm. Maybe she had been hungry for purpose and adopted a language that sounded modern rather than kind. After that meeting, a few of us started gathering, quietly at first, on my porch, then at Nancy's kitchen table, under the yellow lamplight and the smell of her baking. We read scripture and we made lists. Who needed rides, which houses had bad steps, which ones missed birthdays. We called people. We drove. We baked. We sat in hospital rooms and waited through nights like we always had. Word spread more softly than a bulletin ever could. Melissa came by once unannounced. She stood on my porch, hands clasped in front of her, the silver cross catching the sun. I wanted to talk, she said. She told me about her plans, about volunteers who'd signed up, about budgets balanced and community partnerships. Her voice was earnest. Underneath the words was something like apology, but she never said the thing that would hurt her most, acknowledgement. You can build all the centers you like, I told her quietly, looking at the faint crease at the corner of her mouth. But those of us who hold this place understand what it takes to keep somebody from being forgotten. She looked down at her shoes. For a moment the iPad was in her hands, then she folded them, as if to put them away. We want everyone, she said. Truly. I nodded. I wanted to believe her. But belief and practice are different temperatures. Her words were warm in tone. Her actions would be the true measure. In the months that followed, nearly half of our congregation came with us to living rooms and basements. We didn't sign anything dramatic. We simply visited. We cooked casseroles and listened. We created a rhythm that fit the people we'd been serving for decades. The church continued on in a new building plan and a new vision. Richard kept his pulpit and his bright brochures. Melissa became popular with some, and with others she remained the polite face of change. I still visit. My mittens are fraying at the thumbs. My little pocket Bible still has names tucked in its pages. The house groups meet by lamplight and slow coffee. We are smaller now, but our hands are full. The wound of that public dismissal never fully healed. My pride still smarting on certain nights. Yet beneath it there is a steadiness I had forgotten I had. The ministry, the people who taught me how to keep breathing when a monitor flatlines, kept me. And sometimes when Melissa comes into a room with a clipboard, I see her glance toward the corner where an old hymnal sits, and for a second, whatever plans she holds appear thin against the weight of a life lived in front porches and hospital beds. She offers a smile then, a small uncertain thing. I do not always answer it, but I notice it. It is an invitation still, and the work of mercy is long enough for more than one heart to learn. After that Wednesday the room felt smaller. I don't know when people learn to look away with such practiced ease, but they did. On Sunday mornings the sanctuary was full of eyes that slid right past me. Polite, quick little glances that never settled. Conversations that used to begin with, "How is Mrs. Alvarez?" now started with weather and the building fund. The hum of the air conditioner was the only thing that filled the gaps. It began as small things. The woman who used to stand 2 pews behind me and save a cushion for my purse started slipping into the back row and pretending not to see me. The young couple who always asked for prayer after the service now whispered at the door, as if I might overhear them and they would forget their plea. A child I'd sung to in the hospital years before hid behind his mother when I smiled in the foyer. I felt like a ghost moving among my own memories. Whispers swelled like something alive. They weren't loud, never loud. A soft "did you hear?" behind a bulletin. A half-laughed question clipped into a sentence that ended before my ear. When I walked down the hallway to get my coat, voices folded away from me, sliding into other rooms. The coffee pot kept boiling, but no one handed me a cup. Plates passed by my elbow at potlucks as if I were a stranger who might soil the china. Bulletins changed. My name, once in the program beside Visitation Ministry, was gone. In its place was a neat heading. Ministry of Connections, Leadership, Melissa Johnson. The print looked professional, the kind of ink that announces a new era. But it felt like a sign posted over old pictures. When I pointed it out, a young woman from the welcome team looked at her clipboard and apologized as if she had been instructed to do so. Her apology was soft, rehearsed. Her eyes didn't meet mine. Doors began to close. Not all at once. Not with a bang. A folded leaflet slid to the floor. A doorway some members stopped answering calls. The phone in my bag, which used to buzz with requests for prayer or a ride to a doctor, went quiet in a way that made my chest ache. When Nancy called, her voice was steady but smaller than it used to be, like someone speaking into a pillow. Walter's calls were fewer. When he came by, he sat with his hands folded, eyes fixed on the grain of the table as if counting the minutes until he had to leave. There were nights I'd walk past the church while someone inside practiced hymns or cleaned pews. I'd stand under the soft light and listen. Laughter would rise, young, bright, and then it would catch when it reached the corner where I stood. Once, a young deacon's wife looked over and hurried her steps until she was safely in a car with the doors locked. Even the children seemed coached. They clustered where the new teal curtain cast light and did not stray into the front rows where my hymnals lay. Deacon Thompson tried to resist the flow of it, but I could see the way the tide pulled at him. He would meet my eye, and for a moment his expression said everything we had lived through together. Chapel baptisms, funerals at odd hours, the hard work of committees. Then he'd lower his gaze as if reminding himself that institutions had schedules and procedures. Once, after a meeting, he stopped me in the parish hall and gripped my elbow with a hand that still smelled faintly of lemon oil. "Abigail," he whispered, "we'll do what we can." His voice was a promise thinned by caution. Richard's smile was the hardest to read. It was there, polished, present on bulletins in the foyer, in the way he stood under the pulpit. But when our eyes met, the smile never reached the corners. He moved through the room like a man already halfway to the next plan. Melissa, for her part, would pass with polite nods, her iPad held to her chest like a shield. Once she stopped long enough to say, "We're trying to do more for everybody," and in that sentence was the riddle: who belonged to everybody and who became polite collateral? The isolation gathered weight each week. People I had visited for decades came to church less often. Some moved to the new service times on the other side of town. Others simply drifted away, citing health or schedules, truths that also happened, but the pattern felt deliberate. When I showed up to a fellowship luncheon, the circle at my usual table had already shifted. A chair remained empty, a small, glaring absence. The last straw was trivial and ordinary. A woman I'd driven to appointments for years crossed the parking lot and slipped inside the glass doors, then let them close before I reached her. She didn't see the way my hand paused on the handle. She didn't hear the hollow sound that made in my chest. Behind that glass, life carried on with new colors and shiny renderings. Outside, my shadow stretched long across the pavement, and I smelled the faint chlorine of the church fountain. Standing there with the sun at my back and the building light bright in front of me, I felt the circle close, pressed in like damp clothes. My fists found the edges of my hymnal so hard the paper trembled. The voices inside sounded small, their laughter clipped by the edges of the glass. For a while I thought silence would break me. But in that quiet, a different sound rose, soft, steady. The memory of a hand I'd held through chemotherapy. The voice of a man thanking me for sitting with his wife through the night. Those names in my pocket Bible began to call me back. The doors were closing, yes. But somewhere, someone was still waiting in a living room with a lamp and a kettle. And so I started to walk away from the closed doors, not because I'd surrendered, but because I had somewhere to go where the light was warm and the people would look me in the eye. The moment he said it, the sound itself seemed to rearrange the room. Pastor Richard's voice came through the microphone, smooth and practiced, the edges sanded off by training and rehearsal. "Our dear sister Abigail Lewis has decided to retire from visitation ministry." The syllables landed like coins on the wooden pews. I felt them. My hands were folded in my lap. I could feel the threadbare fabric of my cardigan under my fingers. I had been trying all morning to breathe slowly, in for 4, out for 6, the same way I'd taught anxious families in hospital rooms. In, out. Keep steady. But the breath wanted to jump like a trapped bird. Around us, applause began soft and then swelled. It hit me like cold water. The hymn book cut into my palm. The ink on the edge left a smear I would not feel until later, when my fingers shook and I saw the dark on paper. The sanctuary smelled of wax and lemon oil, of old wood, and the citrus of his cologne carried forward on the air. That smell hooked into the moment like an accusation. I felt the urge to fold, to slip into the back and let it pass, to tuck the hymn book away where no one could see it. But there was something in me older than politeness. Years of standing vigil at bedside had taught me the anatomy of a crisis. Name it, face it, do not let it metastasize in silence. I stood. My shoes made a soft scuff on the aisle runner. The light from the stained glass threw slashes of color across the floor, and for a second a purple band lay across my skirt like a hymn. People turned. Some faces were open with genuine surprise. Others had the practiced blank of those who will wait to see which side the room falls on. Melissa's smile was already crawling into place, neat and rehearsed, her iPad cradled like a shield. "Pastor," I said. My voice sounded small at first, then more present than I felt. I set my Bible on the lectern and felt the grain of the wood through my fingertips. The microphone gave a small electrical purr, as if it recognized a different kind of truth about to be spoken. He tilted his head, the smile still in place. "Yes, Abigail?" I took my phone from my bag. It vibrated once, then lay still in my palm. I could feel the buzzing under the skin of my hand like a heartbeat. "I recorded our last conversation," I said. The sentence felt very simple. I hadn't planned the theatrics. I had planned the truth. When I hit play, his voice filled the sanctuary. Not the warm sermon cadence, but the clipped, private register he uses in staff meetings. "We'll reevaluate her role," he said on the recording. "Maybe time for new leadership." The words echoed off the rafters and landed like pebbles in the hush. A candle on the altar sputtered as if in the same breath. The flame wavered. For an instant every face in the room watched that small fire decide. Then it went out. A hush folded over the congregation like a blanket. The silence had weight. I could hear the soft scrape of a choir member shifting. A little wooden crucifix that hung on the front of the pulpit shuddered with the vibration and slid, slow as a confession, off its nail. It hit the lectern with a soft, ridiculous knock and rolled to rest against my Bible. The sound felt obscene in the quiet, a small private collapse. Pastor Richard's practiced smile faltered. His hands fluttered in a gesture that was meant to soothe. "This was an administrative decision," he began, the words ready, "for the good of the church." Deacon Thompson stood then, like someone answering a drill he'd spent a lifetime learning. His voice cut across the soft spill of murmurs. "No one told the council." The words were not loud, but they landed like a verdict. He stepped forward, and his presence tightened the room. He had that veteran posture that says you keep your temper because you know how much work goes into maintaining it. Melissa's fingers tightened on her iPad. Up close, the silver cross at her throat caught the light and flashed. She rose as if to speak, then did not. Her eyes flicked to Richard, and I saw the momentary doubt cross her face. The kind of pause that means a plan is meeting a life it didn't account for. I reached inside my bag again and drew out the stack of printouts. The pages were warm from my hands. They smelled like office ink in my kitchen table, like evidence and life. I handed them to Deacon Thompson. He took them, his jaw set, and the rustle of paper sounded very loud in the quiet. "You announced her resignation without consulting the council," he said. "Not to me but to the whole room. This was done to reshape leadership, not to care for people." A woman I visit came forward, Janice, who always held her purse like a prayer. Her voice trembled and then found itself. "They stopped bringing the large print hymnals," she said. "They said they'd streamline." The sentence landed like a photograph. Another voice, then another. Stories began to unfold in small fragments. Missed visits, doors left unknocked, the name of someone gone from a prayer list. Richard opened his mouth and tried to stitch it back together with the smooth language of future growth and vision. Numbers. Demographics. Outreach. Richard cleared his throat. For the first time all afternoon his words did not find their center. He looked smaller, not because anyone had raised a hand, but because the room had refused the story he'd told them without me in it. In the space he left, something that had been closing opened, a possibility that our ministry could not be erased with a smile and a bulletin. I stood there with the phone in my hand, the little gold cross warm against my chest, and for the first time that day I let myself believe that a truth spoken plainly might just be enough. The room held its breath. For a long moment I felt like the inside of an ear. Everything small and secret and amplifying. My phone sat on the lectern, its tiny speaker filling the sanctuary with the private version of Pastor Richard's voice. When it stopped, a new silence pressed in. The kind that makes you notice the hum of the air conditioner, the soft scrape of a shoe, the way someone clears their throat when they are deciding whether to speak. Deacon Thompson folded the printouts and looked at me as if he had been handed something heavier than paper. He stepped forward without ceremony and said plainly, "No one told the council." The words were not meant to be dramatic. They were a statement of fact, and in that moment facts do the strangest thing, they make people uncomfortable in their seats. Faces shifted. Small confessions slid out like coins from pockets. Janice, who always kept her purse like a talisman, told how the large print hymnals had stopped appearing. A young father remembered that his mother, who had loved the Wednesday soup, had stopped coming because the fellowship hall steps were impossible for her walker. A choir member, one of the quiet ones, muttered, "They took the bedside visits off the schedule." Each small admission landed and multiplied. Melissa's face tightened. Up close her polish was perfect. She rose to speak and then did not. Her fingers went back to the little silver cross at her throat, and I saw, for the first time, the conflict that had lived behind a practiced smile. She said carefully, "We want outreach. We want growth." The words were correct. What they did not acknowledge were the people who had already been there. Pastor Richard cleared his throat. He tried to dress the move in the language of stewardship and future vision. It sounded like brochure copy in a room full of real lives. He raised numbers. He said strategy. The words slid along the varnish of the lectern and did not stick. What shifted the room was not an accusation that flashed and died. It was the slow, accumulative weight of witnesses. People began to speak in fragments, names, places, small hurts turned public. She took my birthday card off the list. The volunteer who used to get us to appointments. She's gone. The council papers I had handed over were not only proofs, they were maps of relationships, the sort of mundane record no brochure could show. Deacon Thompson set the emails down like a ledger. He said, slow and sort of stunned, "This wasn't an oversight. It was a plan." That line hung between us like a rope, taut and undeniable. You could see who wanted to pull back and who was already holding on. I didn't triumph. There was no grand confession, no dramatic apology that washed the hurt clean. But there was a shift. People who had once smiled politely from a distance now folded forward, leaning into the small domestic truths we'd laid on the table. The younger faces in the back, who had been thrilled by renderings of glass and light, found themselves looking at faces they had known since childhood. A few of them blinked as the brochure gloss peeled away. Afterward, a number of members came not to offer platitudes, but to tell stories, of late-night drives to the ER, of visits that should have happened and didn't, of a mother who stopped attending because the only door was a step too high. Each story was a small electric thing. They didn't erase what happened, but they did something else. They reclaimed the ledger of who we are. That night, Deacon Thompson called a brief council meeting. We sat around the same scarred oak table where budgets and potlucks had been discussed for decades. The fluorescent light hummed, syrupy and ordinary. There was no grand judgment. There was a vote to acknowledge procedure had been bypassed. There was no criminal charge, no dramatic ousting. But there were minutes that now included the word oversight and a note to reassess communication practices. For me, the victory was quieter. It was made of a dozen small validations. A member who had been avoiding my call showed up 2 days later with a casserole and an apology. A young couple who had learned to make new plans came with a list of names and asked how they could help. Nancy dropped by the next morning with a thermos and the smell of ginger and warm sugar. Walter sat in my kitchen and tapped the table with a slow, steady hand as he recounted congregants who wanted to join our visits again. I could feel the pressure under my ribs ease, but not like a band coming off. It was more like the loosening of a tight knot. The humiliation of hearing my ministry announced without my consent did not vanish. I wore it like a bruise for a long time. But the bruise taught me something about the people who lived beside me in pews and porches. Their loyalty was not merely nostalgic. It was a muscle, used most in the small, quiet work of visiting. We began to meet in kitchens. Not because we wanted to flee the church, but because the work needed a place that accepted the people who needed it. Nancy's house filled with the aroma of coffee and sugar. Walter drove me to 3 houses in a day and whistled old hymns under his breath while I rolled bandage tape. Melissa came once. Not as a leader with a plan, but as a woman who wanted to understand why a widow had stopped answering her phone. She sat on my porch, hands folded, and listened. She did not have all the answers. She had an earnestness that in time could be shaped into humility, if she chose it. As for Pastor Richard, he kept his pulpit. He still spoke about vision and growth. The building plans went on in brochures and meetings. But the council minutes included those small procedural checks now. People began to ask more questions. They learned slowly how to measure charisma against care. 6 months later, we were not a large congregation. We were smaller, but our lists were full. We had a roster of drivers and people who could sit with someone in the night. We baked casseroles and learned the routes through neighborhoods like cartographers. The ministry I thought had been taken from me had, in fact, been released into a new form. It was no longer anchored to a pulpit or a program. It lived in a crockpot on Nancy's counter, in plates left on porches, in the soft light of bedside lamps. Sometimes I still passed the church on my afternoon walks. I watched the new sign going up, the modern logo in glossy letters. I feel a brief, honest sting. And then I look to the left, toward a row of small houses where a meeting is already started, and I hear someone singing a hymn by heart, note by careful note. The song is not polished. It is a little off-key, a little human, and more than enough. There was no miraculous vindication that erased pain. But there was truth spoken, witnesses gathered, and a congregation that, bit by bit, remembered what it means to be a church for those who are easy to forget. That was the turn. Not the taking back of a title, but the reclaiming of a calling. My hands are busy still. My pocket Bible is softer. My feet know the way. And when I sit down beside someone in the dark and hold their hand, I feel something like home. The days after the council meeting settled into a quieter kind of work. I woke the same 5:30, the kitchen window pale with October light, the coffee steam curling like a small prayer. My pocket Bible lay open on the table. Its pages are soft now, the corners rounded where I've tucked names. Mrs. Alvarez, Mr. Carter, Janice. The ink smells like the afternoons when I wrote letters and the nights I sat with the breathing machine and learned to hum so the fear inside a room would keep time. We stopped going to the big Sunday service as a single body. We did not march out in protest. We carried casseroles. We set folding chairs in living rooms and lit lamps that made faces warmer than the pulpit light ever did. People arrived with keys in their hands and stories in their pockets. Nancy's kitchen smelled of ginger and sugar. Walter drove and whistled old hymns under his breath while I checked a list and made sure the thermos had coffee. It was smaller, yes, but it was fuller. The work is not measured by applause. It is measured by the sound of a widow's breath easing. The way a shoulder stops trembling when someone sits and does not hurry. I learned again how to read a room by the way the curtains are tied. by the sound of a television turned down when a prayer begins. Melissa came once like someone stepping into an old photograph. She sat on my porch with her iPad on her lap and listened. Not to correct me, we did not attempt to close the church. Richard kept his pulpit and the new building plans went on flickering in glossy slides and meetings. You have to live with contradictions, charisma and hardness side by side, smiles that don't reach eyes. I learned to attend to the difference between leadership that serves and leadership that seeks to remake a story without asking the people whose lives the story belonged to. There are nights I walk past the old sanctuary. The new sign gleams in the parking lot with clean lettering. On some Sundays I stand for a moment on the sidewalk and I can hear the echo of praise through the windows, voices learning new harmonies. My chest still tightens. It is ordinary grief. A small, slow hollow that will not entirely close. But grief makes room for other things. It is not an ending. It is a clearing. Our gatherings look like church in a way that matters more than a steeple. We have a roster taped to a cupboard door. We know who needs rides this week. We know which walker needs oiling and which furnace keeps coughing at night. We sing sometimes off-key and it feels more honest for it. We read the scriptures out loud in afternoons that smell like lemon oil and warm bread. We pray with hands that still know how to steady a pulse. Sometimes Melissa shows up at a hospital room, clipboard tucked away, eyes less certain. She sits down and learns that listening is a kind of presence that does not need a program. She still has plans. I have my list. There is room for both if humility is the line we keep. The old hymnal lives now under my arm or on the seat beside me. The spine is soft from years of thumbed pages. Once, after a long night of visits, I left it on a pew and walked away without noticing. Later I drove back and found it there. A single thing left behind. It did not belong to the building. It belonged to a practice, turning to the Psalms when there is nothing else to say. People ask if I have any regrets. Sometimes the answer is the ache of an announcement I never made, the way a word can be taken from you and given away. Other times the answer is simply the circle of hands around a table, the way a casserole dish passes from one to another and returns warmed and empty because the food was eaten and the night held. I have learned to measure faith not by the numbers on a bulletin but by the soft certainties. Who shows up at dawn when a hospital monitor blinks? Who remembers a birthday? Who holds a hand through the long small hours? The ministry was never a title on a program. It was a rhythm. Losing the program did not stop the rhythm. It made it portable. There are mornings I still set my cardigan over my shoulders and pin the little gold cross where it always sits. I walk out with my keys and my list and a thermos. The porch light in some houses flickers on just as I step up the walk. A hand opens the door before I knock. I am greeted with a small sigh of relief, as if a lamp had been turned on. When I think about that night in the sanctuary, I remember how the crucifix rolled and clattered at my feet. A ridiculous private noise in a great hush. I remember the hush itself, and the way truth sounded when it was finally spoken plainly. I remember the long bench where I had sat and how, after we left, it looked somehow different, smaller, yes, and with an imprint where my hymnals used to rest. Now, on some afternoons I walk by that bench. It sits empty. The sunlight falls across the wood and warms the grain. I listen for anything. Maybe the distant echo of voices, but mostly I hear my own shoes on the sidewalk, the soft whisper of wind through the maples, and then the slow, steady sound of footsteps moving away toward porches in lamp light. The door closes behind me on the church sometimes with that hollow, decisive click. The wind comes and pushes it shut. It is not a slam. It is not a final judgment. It is a small, ordinary closing. And on the other side, in kitchens and cars, in hospital rooms and in the quiet of a night watch, a different door opens. I walk on. My steps are the same ones I took when I first went out to sit with a frightened young mother in an emergency room. The pocket Bible is warm in my bag. The names inside are still there. The work continues, soft, relentless, merciful. The bench is empty. The footsteps fade. The wind closes the door. And we begin again. The months after that Wednesday settled into a rhythm that felt oddly like relief. I wake at 5:30, the October light still small, the kettle already humming. The pocket Bible is warm in my bag. Nancy's kitchen smells of ginger and sugar, and Walter whistles the old hymns in a key that suits his hands. We meet in living rooms now, lamps low, folding chairs in a circle, casserole dishes steaming on card tables. The light is softer there than under the stage lights of the sanctuary, but it falls on faces the same way, honest and unvarnished. The bruise of public humiliation doesn't fade in a neat line. Some nights I still feel the sting, my name announced like something handed away. Sometimes I drive past the church and stop at the corner, hands on the wheel, listening to voices through tinted glass. The sign gleams, the renderings show shiny windows. I feel a small sharpness like a splinter under the skin. Then I turn the key and head to a house where someone is waiting for a bowl of soup and a hymn. We rebuilt, not as an institution with brochures, but as a circle that knows who needs a ride, who needs a hand steadied, who needs a simple call. Lists hang on Nancy's refrigerator, a paper tack sticking out at an angle. The names there are not bullet points. They are midnight stories and birthdays and medications. We learned again how to coordinate by phone, by knock, by showing up. It is ordinary logistics and holiness too. People came back slowly. Some came with casseroles and apologies. Some slipped in quietly, like neighbors at a potluck. Others didn't return at all. That absence keeps a patient ache. There are faces I miss. People who have moved away or who have let the world's new timetables make their attendance impossible. I remember them in the margin of my Bible, names written in a hurried hand. They are reasons I keep going. Deacon Thompson did what he had always done. He turned up and kept his promises. He sat with us at Nancy's table and told his old stories, the ones that make you understand why procedure matters because people matter. His gravitas quieted rooms and gave words weight. Melissa came again too. Once she sat on my porch with her iPad tucked away and she listened. She asked about Mrs. Alvarez's favorite hymn rather than talking about capital campaigns. It was a small thing, but it felt like a fissure opening toward something softer. Pastor Richard stayed at the pulpit. He has his building plans and his vision nights. Some days I feel anger at the way he used charm like a saw, neat, precise, cutting through what doesn't fit. Other days I feel pity. People who build empires of charisma are often people with great loneliness inside. I don't seek his ruin. I only want the church to remember the people who sit in the wings while programs are planned. Our work is quieter now. We sit by hospital beds, hold hands through long nights, sort mail for people who can't get to the post office, and teach a young mother to make the casseroles that travel well. We laugh because laughter is prayer with its hands unbound. We bicker over which hymn to sing, off-key yes, but with such devotion that even God might have to clap. There were moments of surprise, small human reconciliations that felt like seeds planted in poor soil and somehow sprouting. Melissa showed up at a hospice once and sat through the long hours. She didn't take charge. She sat and learned the shape of grief. I watched her fold a blanket the way my mother taught me. Slowly, reverently. It was not an apology, but it was a beginning. I keep the hymn book with the ink smear from that day. Sometimes I open it and the paper whispers like an old friend. The gold cross on my cardigan is slightly scuffed now. I like its imperfect shine. The cups at Nancy's house are sometimes chipped. We drink from them anyway, because the work we do is not about polish. It's about presence. At night I think about the tiny crucifix that rolled from the pulpit and clattered at my feet. The absurd sound in that great hush. I think about the hush after the recording played and how people began to tell the names of the ones who had been left behind. That hush turned into words. The words turned into gatherings. The gatherings turned into visits. The stairwell of a fellowship hall did not become accessible overnight, but someone had already learned to bring the meal to the porch. There are still things unresolved. I do not pretend that pride and institutional impulse do not have power. There will always be leaders whose vocabulary is slicker than their compassion. But I learned something stubborn and gentle. Systems can remove a title, but they cannot erase a practice that has been tended by hand. If you've made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the end. If you feel it in your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next stories, and keep walking with me by watching the other videos I've prepared with care. And please, share in the comments what you thought of my testimony. I will read every word.